The first time the signal reached Earth, it was almost dismissed as background noise. Buried beneath layers of cosmic chatter, it pulsed with an unusual regularity, a rhythm that seemed deliberate. Analysts at the Deep Space Listening Array stared at the data in disbelief, before escalating it through channels meant only for the most extraordinary discoveries. By the time it reached the United Nations Council, the verdict was clear. Humanity was no longer alone. The Zarathans had spoken. The broadcast was short, its message elegantly simple, translated by algorithms in seconds. We invite humanity to a summit of peace. Let us unite under shared purpose. For weeks, headlines filled with promises of a new era. Politicians framed the invitation as validation of mankind's long struggle. Religious leaders spoke of prophecy fulfilled. Scientists speculated on technologies beyond imagination, cures to every disease, solutions to hunger and energy crises. The air carried a weight of anticipation that even cynics could not entirely shrug off. Humanity, fractured for centuries, suddenly felt bound by a single thread: curiosity. Preparations moved with unprecedented speed. Delegates were chosen, men and women who represented every continent, every creed, every discipline. Scientists, linguists, cultural experts, military officers dressed more for ceremony than for war. The final roster read like the dream team of a generation, individuals burdened with the impossible task of speaking for billions. A dozen starships were fitted for the journey, but only one was selected to carry the delegation, a vessel renamed Unity. Its hull bore the flags of nations that had sworn enemies only months before. The journey itself was measured not just in light years but in psychological distance. Inside the ship, humans rehearsed diplomacy, memorized protocols, and calmed their nerves with manufactured optimism. They passed through wormhole corridors mapped by alien beacons, space folding like origami at coordinates given in the original signal. Even the most skeptical among them could not deny the magnitude of what they were part of. They were leaving behind a troubled planet, arriving at a frontier where peace seemed not only possible but inevitable. When the veil of wormhole distortion lifted and the Zarathan world came into view, silence filled the observation deck. The planet shimmered like a jewel, oceans gleaming with hues Earth had never known, landmasses laced with luminous networks that pulsed like veins. Great structures spiraled upward, blending seamlessly with landscapes that appeared half organic, half engineered. It was as though the planet itself was alive, breathing with slow dignity. The Unity received clearance, guided into orbit by escorts that glided like predatory fish, sleek and gleaming. They did not speak over comms, merely surrounded the human vessel with unblinking presence. When docking was complete, the humans were met with a reception that seemed designed to overwhelm. The Zarathans themselves emerged in ceremonial formation. Tall, elegant, their forms draped in fabrics that shimmered with every movement, they walked with a grace that spoke of both power and control. Their features were alien yet disturbingly symmetrical, faces too perfect, smiles stretched just a little too long. They bowed low, speaking words translated instantly by devices humanity had barely begun to understand. "Welcome, children of Earth. Tonight, you are our honored guests." Every moment that followed pressed deeper into spectacle. The humans were escorted through avenues lined with citizens who cheered in haunting, harmonic tones. Towers rose above them, constructed of materials that seemed to shift like liquid crystal, reflecting the visitors back in strange distortions. Food stalls released intoxicating aromas, though none resembled any earthly cuisine. It was overwhelming, a city built not merely for habitation but for awe. Inside the palace, the hospitality only intensified. The great hall was lit by pillars that glowed from within, bathing everything in a warm golden hue. Tables stretched endlessly, covered in dishes so extravagant they seemed sculpted rather than cooked. Meats marbled in colors unknown, fruits that shimmered as though dusted with stars, liquids that refracted light into rainbows with every pore. The Zarathans pressed their guests to eat, insisting that no peace could be sealed without sharing food. But the humans were cautious. They had been warned by their own scientists that biochemistry was not to be taken lightly. Diplomatic smiles masked polite refusals, and while they tasted what appeared to be harmless fruit, they kept to the rations they had brought from Earth. The Zarathans only smiled wider, raising their glasses in elaborate toasts. Beneath the warmth, a subtle unease lingered. The air was too thick with fragrance, the laughter of the hosts too rehearsed. Every cheer felt slightly delayed, as though citizens responded not with joy but with obedience. Soldiers among the delegation felt it most keenly. The way guards stood at every archway, how their weapons gleamed though concealed. Peace was the declared purpose, but control was the unspoken truth. The first banquet ended with speeches. The Zarathans extolled the virtues of unity, describing their civilization as the culmination of countless alliances with other species. They painted themselves as shepherds of peace, guardians of the galactic order. The humans clapped, words of praise delivered through translation, but some noticed details that didn't align. Why had no other allied species joined this summit? Where were the ambassadors of worlds supposedly uplifted by Zarathan wisdom? The delegation dismissed these questions in whispers, agreeing to wait for tomorrow's talks. But unease had already seated itself, silent yet persistent. Later, when the humans retired to chambers prepared for them, the atmosphere shifted again. Rooms were beautiful yet uncomfortably uniform. Windows overlooked alien gardens where lights flickered like fireflies caught in glass. The air smelled faintly metallic, a scent that clung to the lungs. Guards stood just out of view, their presence unmistakable. It was hospitality, yes, but hospitality under surveillance. One of the soldiers, Commander Reyes, lingered near the window long after others slept. He watched shadows move across the garden, creatures that never came fully into view. He listened to distant sounds, echoes that could have been music, or screams carried by wind. His instincts screamed caution, though his orders demanded diplomacy. He muttered under his breath, unheard by anyone but himself, "Something's off. This isn't peace. This is theater." The next morning, the delegation awoke to another display of grandeur. An escort led them through halls where murals depicted scenes of Zarathans welcoming alien envoys, feasts stretching across millennia. But the eyes in the paintings seemed too fixed, the smiles too identical. The message was obvious. This was a civilization defined by its ability to host. Yet a quiet part of the human psyche whispered, hosts of what? When the delegation sat once more for a ceremonial meal, the Zarathans leaned forward eagerly. Their eyes glistened as humans sampled delicacies, clapping as though every bite were a sacred act. A diplomat remarked on the richness of the flavors, though he forced a smile to hide his unease. The Zarathans answered with a phrase that lingered longer than it should have. "What is peace if not the sharing of flesh?" Some laughed nervously, chalking it up to translation error. Others looked down at their plates and wondered what kind of flesh they were truly being offered. The peace talks began in a chamber that seemed to pulse with life. The walls themselves glowed faintly, as if the very structure of the palace contained veins through which light flowed. The Zarathans sat at the head of the vast circular table, their posture flawless, their voices resonating with an unnatural harmony. Every word they spoke was framed in the language of cooperation, promises of shared futures, declarations of eternal peace. Yet beneath the polished diplomacy lay something that unsettled the human delegation. The discussions opened with trade. The Zarathans spoke of resources in abundance, rare elements they claimed they would gladly share with Earth. They spoke of cultural exchanges, of knowledge and art, of medicine that could extend human life. But woven into their speech were strange metaphors that slipped past translators without explanation. They spoke of the union of marrow, the bond of blood made literal, and the banquet of peace that requires every guest to partake. At first, humans attributed these phrases to linguistic difference, perhaps poetic flourishes that lost clarity in translation. But the frequency with which they returned began to gnaw at the more attentive delegates. Dr. Sandhu, one of Earth's foremost linguists, frowned during one of the addresses. He whispered to his fellow delegate, "These aren't metaphors. They're idioms with consistent cultural weight. To them, unity and flesh are one and the same." His warning was brushed aside in the flow of conversation. Diplomats, eager to maintain the illusion of progress, insisted on hearing only the surface message. Cooperation, friendship, alliance. To dig deeper might spoil the mood. Hours stretched into a full day. The Zarathans were tireless, never faltering in tone or poise. They smiled constantly, their eyes gleaming with something that seemed like hunger masquerading as hospitality. When the session closed, the humans were led once again to a banquet. This time the dishes were presented with even greater ceremony, servants lifting lids to reveal steaming cuts of meat that glistened with sauces, fruits that bled with juices, wines that smelled faintly of iron. The humans once again declined most of it, though the pressure to partake had grown heavier. One diplomat caved, sampling a sliver of roasted meat. He chewed slowly, describing it as rich, complex, almost intoxicating. The Zarathans clapped, their laughter echoing too loudly in the chamber. "Yes," their leader purred, "the flesh binds us. The meal is the treaty. To eat is to become part of us." The words unsettled the listeners, though again the official record framed it as ceremonial speech. Later that night, unease deepened. Dr. Vega, a biologist, wandered through adjoining corridors under the guise of curiosity. The guards, strangely confident, did not attempt to restrain her, allowing her deeper into the palace than she expected. She discovered a chamber colder than the rest, filled with crystalline pods that glowed faintly blue. Within them were bodies, not human, but humanoid enough to draw immediate horror. Tall figures with reptilian skin, others with feathered crests, all suspended as though in eternal sleep. But their condition betrayed the truth. Limbs were missing, chests hollowed, flesh carved with precision. These were not guests preserved for eternity. They were carcasses stored for consumption. Vega staggered back, choking down panic. She recorded as much as she could on her wrist device before retreating, her mind spinning with questions that had only one grim answer. The Zarathans had not invited humanity for diplomacy. They had invited them to dinner. The revelation was shared in hushed voices when the delegation reconvened in their quarters. Shock rippled through the group, denial clashing with fear. Some argued it had to be misunderstanding, evidence of medical preservation, perhaps experiments gone awry. But Vega's recordings left little room for ambiguity. One of the younger soldiers muttered, "They've done this before. Those bodies, they were other guests." The fracture lines widened. Diplomats urged caution, demanding restraint until more evidence could be gathered. Soldiers, led by Commander Reyes, argued that waiting would only give the Zarathans time to prepare their feast. The group fell into uneasy silence, their unity eroded by terror. The next day confirmed their worst fears. A servant approached them in secret, a creature hunched and trembling, its skin pale, its eyes wide with desperation. It was not Zarathan but another alien species, enslaved into service. In broken phrases it whispered a warning. "You are not guests. You are meat. They honor only the flesh. Every world that comes here ends here." The servant fled before guards could catch sight of it, leaving the humans with dread that could no longer be dismissed as paranoia. That evening's banquet carried a weight of inevitability. The hall was darker, torches casting elongated shadows across the walls. The dishes brought forth were richer, the aromas overwhelming, the pressure to eat undeniable. At the center of the table, beneath a dome of gold, the main dish was unveiled. The humans gasped as they saw it, a torso unmistakably humanoid, though not human, carved and roasted with cruel precision. The Zarathans beamed, lifting their glasses in salute. "This is the fruit of unity," they declared, "the sharing of what is most sacred." Horror swept the delegation. One diplomat vomited, another collapsed in shock. Soldiers reached instinctively for weapons they had been allowed only ceremonially. The Zarathans did not flinch. Their smiles sharpened, their eyes gleamed with predatory anticipation. They had dropped the pretense at last. The humans were told, in chilling clarity, that the peace talks were nothing more than a ritual. Each species invited to the palace was judged not by their words but by their flavor, their resistance, their capacity to be broken. To consume another was, in Zarathan belief, the highest form of alliance, the only peace worth forging. And humanity had now reached the climax of its invitation. The banquet devolved into chaos. Guards surrounded the humans, weapons humming with energy. Delegates screamed, soldiers barked orders, the Zarathans clapped as though enjoying theater. The humans resisted, flipping tables, using whatever objects they could as makeshift weapons. Some were seized instantly, dragged toward the feasting pits. Others managed to escape into adjoining corridors, hearts pounding, minds racing with the brutal truth. They were not negotiators. They were prey. And the palace, with its endless corridors and suffocating surveillance, was nothing more than a labyrinth designed to keep them trapped until the feast was complete. Panic had splintered the human delegation, but panic was only the first impulse. Beneath fear lived something deeper, something older, a survival instinct woven into every strand of their being. In the labyrinth of alien corridors, breathless and bruised, they gathered what remained of their composure. They were not soldiers of fortune or adventurers trained for alien wars. They were representatives, scientists, thinkers, and leaders. Yet in that moment they became something far simpler, a species that refused to be eaten. Commander Reyes assumed control with the authority of necessity. His voice cut through the haze of terror, anchoring the delegation in a single truth. They could not afford hesitation. The Zarathans had underestimated them, treating them as another herd to be led to slaughter. That miscalculation was humanity's only advantage. "We use what we have," Reyes growled. "We adapt. We survive. That's who we are." Weapons were scarce. The ceremonial arms they carried were never meant for battle, but hands that had built civilizations could improvise. Scientists began stripping alien devices from the walls, finding conduits of power that could be rigged into crude weapons. Metal rods became spears, shards of crystalline dacre became blades. Dr. Vega repurposed medical instruments into tools of defense. Even the diplomats, once reliant on words, found themselves gripping improvised arms with trembling determination. The first skirmish tested their resolve. Alien guards advanced, their movements confident, certain of superiority. They had preyed on species that accepted their fate, that folded under terror, but humans fought differently. They struck with chaos, attacking from unexpected angles, feigning weakness then lashing out with ferocity. A guard fell, its chest pierced by sharpened crystal. Another crumpled beneath the sheer desperation of fists and improvised clubs. Blood dark and viscous splattered across the walls, shocking both sides. The humans, breath ragged and eyes wide, realized they had drawn first blood against their would-be predators. For the Zarathans, the shock was worse. No guest had ever resisted this way. None had dared. The labyrinth became their battleground. Each corridor twisted into opportunity. Humans laid traps with broken furniture, lured guards into ambushes, used fire stolen from ceremonial torches to blind and confuse. Their ingenuity was relentless, fueled not by training but by refusal to surrender. Fear transformed into strategy, despair into defiance. The palace, designed as a theater for ritual slaughter, now turned against its architects. The Zarathans responded with fury, their arrogance slipping. More guards poured into the halls, their weapons humming with lethal energy. Yet they faltered against tactics they could not predict. Humanity's strength was not in raw power but in unpredictability. Soldiers and scientists alike wove together strategies born in moments, improvising with instinct sharpened by desperation. Every human loss was felt keenly, but every alien death fueled the fire of survival. What the Zarathans failed to understand was that humanity had been shaped by adversity long before this encounter. They had endured plagues, wars, famine, and their own self-destruction. They had clawed their way out of caves, survived ice ages, crossed oceans with nothing but faith in the stars. They were not strangers to being hunted. They were the species that had made predators fear fire, that had risen by turning weakness into cunning. And now, in the halls of an alien palace, that history roared back to life. The humans discovered communication consoles, and with them, a revelation that widened the scope of their struggle. The Zarathans had not confined their cruelty to one species. Countless others had been lured before, their signals of distress intercepted and silenced. Whole civilizations had been culled, reduced to delicacies at banquets masked as treaties. The frozen bodies Vega had seen were not anomalies. They were remnants of an endless feast that spanned centuries. The humans broadcast a message through the system, hijacking the channels. Their words reached not only the palace but the enslaved species laboring in its shadows. "You are not alone," the transmission declared. "Rise with us, or you will be next." The palace quaked with the consequences. The servants who had once moved in silence began to hesitate, their fear bending into defiance. Chains loosened, whispers spread like wildfire, and in the hidden quarters of the capital, rebellion ignited. The humans had struck not only at their captors, but at the foundation of their empire: control through fear. The Zarathans could not comprehend the contagion of resistance. They had ruled for too long, believing consumption was destiny, that every species would fold before inevitability. Humanity shattered that illusion. For the first time, the predators faced prey that refused to lie down. And in that refusal, the humans became something far more dangerous than a meal. They became an idea. The climax approached in a torrent of blood and fire. The delegation, fractured and battered, pushed toward the great hall where the feast had been meant to conclude. Their numbers had thinned, yet their determination had hardened into steel. Every survivor carried the weight of those lost, every step driven by rage as much as survival. The Zarathans awaited them with regality stripped, no longer hosts but cornered beasts. Their leader stood tall, voice still dripping with condescension, even as the walls shook from distant uprisings. "You cannot change the order of the galaxy," he sneered. "You are nothing but flesh, and flesh has one destiny." But humanity had never accepted destiny without a fight. The great hall that once echoed with feasts and hollow toasts now lay in ruins. Fires licked across shattered pillars, smoke curled through fractured ceilings, and the scent of burned flesh replaced the intoxicating aromas that once promised false unity. The Zarathans, once masters of ceremony, now reeled in disbelief at the collapse of their dominion. Their elegance had melted into desperation, their proud bearing crumbling beneath the relentless defiance of those they had thought beneath them. Humanity had not only survived the ritual, they had poisoned it, turning the predator's own theater into a battlefield that stripped them of illusion. But the humans understood their fight was not yet finished. Victory in the hall was only a spark. The empire beyond these walls stretched across star systems, its grip bound by centuries of terror. What they had begun here would either ignite a fire strong enough to consume that empire, or die with them in the ashes. Every survivor knew the cost of failure was annihilation. They had not been invited into the galactic stage as equals. They had forced their way into it as enemies of the old order. The transmission they had sent earlier had already spread further than they imagined. Across the planet, enslaved species rose in hesitant waves of defiance, throwing down tools and chains alike. For some, it was the first act of resistance in generations. For others, it was an eruption of vengeance long suppressed. The Zarathans had built their empire on a foundation of silence, and now the silence was broken. In the confusion, whispers spread of humans who fought not for dominion but survival, who had killed their would-be devourers and lived to tell the tale. To those long shackled in despair, This story was not just rebellion. It was proof that the predators could bleed. The humans regrouped, their numbers reduced but their unity sharper than ever. Exhaustion clung to them, every limb heavy, every breath ragged, yet the fire in their eyes refused to dim. They scavenged weapons from the fallen, piecing together tools of war from alien technology. Reyes, his uniform torn and face streaked with blood, stood at the center of their formation, not as a commander giving orders, but as a man reminding his species of who they were. "They thought we were prey," he said, voice hoarse yet unyielding. "Let's show them what prey can become when cornered." Word reached them of Zarathan reinforcements mobilizing from across the city. War machines stirred, towering constructs that had once paraded through streets as symbols of dominion, now repurposed to crush rebellion. But humans did not wait for the noose to tighten. They moved through the labyrinthine corridors of the capital, turning the city itself into a weapon. Scientists hijacked energy grids, plunging districts into darkness. Soldiers led ambushes in alleys where shadows favored them. Civilians who had been dragged along as observers transformed into fighters when survival demanded it. Diplomats who once prided themselves on careful words now screamed rallying cries that spurred both humans and allies into motion. The Zarathans fought back with the savagery of predators denied their feast. Their voices, once smooth with manipulation, now dripped venom as they commanded their subjects to resist rebellion. But fear had shifted sides. Where one species trembled at the prospect of defiance, now they trembled at the realization that submission guaranteed the slaughterhouse. Better to die fighting than to be carved at banquet tables. The balance of terror had inverted, and humanity was its fulcrum. As battles raged across the capital, humans discovered caches of preserved remains hidden beneath the palace. Entire vaults filled with trophies of their feasts, skulls polished like jewels, bones arranged as ornaments, fragments of civilizations reduced to decoration. The sight hardened their resolve. They had not simply stumbled into a trap. They had uncovered the scale of a crime that spanned centuries, a legacy of horror disguised as culture. To leave it standing was to allow the cycle to continue. With each step forward, humans shed the role thrust upon them by their hosts. They were no longer delegates. They were no longer symbols of diplomacy. They had become something rawer, something the Zarathans could neither predict nor control, a force of survival that could not be reasoned with or consumed.